Perhaps just before I start, I should say that a number of my friends have reacted to the idea of me giving this lecture, and they seem to fall into two groups. I mean, some people are saying, oh, well, thank goodness you're going to tell us what we've always wanted to know. And the others have said, how on earth can you think it's a good idea to lead a balanced life? And, well, of course, I'm not actually going to tell anybody how to do it, but I am going to look at that very question that's posed by that. So you may notice in this lecture that I always call the analyst he and the patient she or her. I mean, that is not meant to be a representation of what I regard as the reality, but it's purely for convenience. So I hope you don't think that I'm very sexist by that usage, but I just couldn't do the he, she, him and her thing all the time. Now, it's not very easy to talk about life as a whole, but before we can begin to consider life stages, we have to have some sort of picture of development which goes on throughout life. And this means raising a fundamental question. Has life a purpose? This is different from asking about the purposes of any individual. We all, of course, have some freedom to decide how to live our lives. But is there some basic ground plan laid down for us which overrides personal choice? These are embarrassing questions for the analyst, who prefers to keep such thoughts to himself. He is grateful that teachers, philosophers, gurus, and clergymen are all more than willing to express their opinions. And he likes to be allowed to retreat into a safe, neutral, objectively scientific position where he will say he is not in the least qualified to discuss such matters. He is only a humble practitioner of analysis. It is not for him to preach or instruct. When his patient says she doesn't know what to do, he will not tell her. Of course, he may not have any idea what she should do, but even if he has, he will consider it better if she finds out for herself. If she protests by saying she thought she'd come to an expert, he might interpret this as being a projection onto him, perhaps an archetype of the old wise man. No, his job is simply to clarify, to give his understanding of what she seems to be unconscious of, and then, when she knows this, she can choose for herself. Of course, she may make the wrong choice, but at least she will have chosen. I'm sure you're all familiar with this stance. I'm not wanting just to caricature it. Analysts should not set out to be teachers. They certainly don't have all the answers, and people do have to find out for themselves. At the same time, it simply won't do to suggest that analysts can help people only by having learned a technique and a theory, and Jung constantly reminded his readers of this. The analyst, to be any good, does need to have a thorough mastery of theory and a sound technical approach. He also needs a deeper understanding of himself, and he needs the sort of understanding of others which comes not from his own long analysis, not only from his own long analysis, but from having lived and continuing to live as full a life as he can, and from having thought long and hard about all these fundamental questions on the meaning of life. All this is in the background as he listens to any particular detail of the patient's life with which he's being entrusted. The questions of ultimate meaning are agonizing ones. We are living in an age when the very survival of the planet is uncertain, and the guidelines which seem to have worked for us don't seem to be applicable anymore. I do not mean simply that religious beliefs are crumbling. That has been happening for a long time. But it has still somehow been possible for an analyst to get by with a rather woolly, agnostic, humanistic, libertarian attitude where the agonizing questions are avoided rather than addressed, and to shelter behind a vaguely benign and tolerant attitude which helps him to attend to details without having to examine the more fundamental questions. The dilemma of the analyst, then, is this. He needs to be as clear as he can about his own values and use them in his work with the patient, but he must not impose them on her. This dilemma is more easily resolved if he introduces certain distinctions which require the dimensions of time and space, or, as I shall try to explain, they require the metaphor of time and space. Now, first, in the time dimension. The analyst has both short and long-term goals. In the short term, he listens to his patient and very carefully attends to whatever she is saying. He is trying to understand it in two ways. He has to understand whatever she understands, and then he tries to understand it in a different framework, one which encompasses what she is unconscious of. These are different understandings, and it is the difference between them which he may then try to articulate in his interpretations. Most of his activities in the short term are devoted to this work. Now, in the longer term, his goals are quite different. He has to ask himself, where are all these interpretations leading? He has to have some notion of where the patient and he are going. He has to ask himself if he is really helping her to lead a better life. And to do this, he has to have at least some idea of what, for the patient, a better life would be. It is true that in practice he may not need to think of these things very often, though some patients do force him to. Usually, though, one advantage of the analytic method is that one does have plenty of time. In the course of time, all will be revealed, and after a time, we see where we have got to. Where we have got to implies a place, and a place means space. So we have the time dimension, now we get on to the space dimension. An image of space is needed for the analyst to reflect that he and his patient may at the same time be in different places. He sees that she is there and he is here, and a space separates them. Usually he has some idea of an optimal space between him and his patient. Not so close that they cannot see each other, but not so distant that they cannot recognize each other. Space and time have also to be combined, because in time one moves through space. I hope it's clear by now that although there is an actual time and space in analysis, as there is in life, I am speaking metaphorically of space and time in order to clarify an apparently insoluble dilemma. The analyst has to separate what he's doing in the short run from what he's hoping to do in the long run. The run takes time, short or long, and takes up space, short or long. Standing back from his work is necessary for any therapist, whether he's a depth psychologist or a behaviorist, to remind himself that in everything he does in therapy, there is an implicit philosophy of life, and he will be a better therapist if he knows what that is. In this lecture, then, I'm talking broadly about life and its aims, but it should not be taken that the detail is unimportant. I'm not speaking of the day-to-day work of the analyst, but the year-to-year. I'm even inclined to say decade to decade, and that might sound a bit depressing, but I don't necessarily mean that analysis has to go on for 20 years or so, but one may need to think about, where's this person going to be in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? So I hope that this will help you to be patient with what might otherwise seem a series of intolerably pompous and meaningless generalizations. Our lives are a struggle between order and disorder. Too much order and we rigidify or stagnate. Too much disorder and we disintegrate. Clearly, we need to balance the two. But I will not be easily intelligible if I remain at the level of abstractions like order and disorder. And to stay in communication with you, I must have recourse to metaphor. Metaphors for life may seem trite and overused, but we need them all the same. I'm thinking of metaphors like life is a journey and life is a story. These are both somewhat restricted metaphors in that they rely on a linear mode of thinking, but we cannot easily think of development or of stages in life without assuming that it has at least, like a narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Or that, as in a journey, we move about, we discover new landscapes, we take wrong turnings, we recognize landmarks, and so on. By speaking broadly and generalizing, I'm doing what all psychologists have to do. Textbooks may contain individual case material, but only because some generalization is going to be made from them. While it's true that we all have to follow our own story, or as Jung said, to live our myth, or to follow our demon, and we all have our own journey to make, which nobody else can make for us, it remains true that there are stories that apply to all of us, so as we may find in the great universal myths, and that in a sense we all make the same journey. Others have always been there before. Having, I hope, apologized enough for being so general, I must also apologize for my temerity in speaking for Jung. No Jungian should ever find themselves agreeing with Jung about everything. But I'm going to assume that in attending these lectures, you'll want to know not what we individually think, but what we as analytical psychologists think, as opposed to, say, psychoanalysts. And to fulfill these expectations, I and the speakers to follow will have to speak within a framework laid down by Jung. Although I cannot be sure that even the general framework I'm proposing will hold for my successors, I apologize in advance if this should turn out to be not the case. There are, it seems to me, certain tenets which Jung held all his life. They may be expressed by Matthew Arnold's desire to see life steadily and to see it whole. Though, of course, he tried not to preach, there's no doubt that Jung set great value on a life that was as full and rich as possible, but was also well balanced. At the same time, and I think this is important, at the same time, he recognized that these were contradictory aims. The full life and the balanced life contains a contradiction. If one wants a rich, full life, one has to take risks. One can keep one's balance by being dull and safe, and one may lose it and die or go mad if one explores too much. In his own personal history, Jung had good reason to know of the dangers, and one can view his whole life's work as an attempt to find answers to these contradictions. So I'm looking at Jung's work as an attempt to resolve this essential contradiction. The answers tend to come in somewhat paradoxical forms. It seems that the life of the psyche itself depends on its presenting itself contradictorily, in the form of seemingly irreconcilable opposites. Irreconcilable, that's to say, at the level at which they present themselves. They could, however, be combined, and then, at a higher level, a third possibility might arise. This can be an endless process. It is one which Jung was inclined to think should only be actively attended to by certain individuals in the second half of life. He called the process leading to higher levels of consciousness individuation. I've referred to the living psyche because complete stasis means death or petrification. Dynamic systems, therefore, need a curious kind of balance. If the opposites are to be balanced, then the psyche, to be alive, needs to balance with imbalance. Symmetry, as symbolized by the female sign, you know the sign I mean, that's for the female, a ring with a cross under it, or the even number 4, has to be balanced with asymmetry, the male sign, the odd number 3. Now, the two halves of life, which Jung talked about, make a whole life, and each has to be balanced with the other, because each is incomplete and ultimately meaningless without the other. Analytical psychologists have mostly not followed Jung in seeing individuation as restricted to the second half of life, but regard it as a lifelong process. Certainly, the phenomena which for Jung characterized individuation, the opposites and their combination through the appearance of archetypal images, can be seen in the youngest children, as Michael Fordham and his followers have shown. But I do want to retain in this lecture the idea of the two halves of life as having different aims, not just because Jung always believed it, but because I think that it remains of central importance in understanding development throughout life, rather than development from infancy to mature adulthood, which I think is the psychoanalytic Freudian tendency, is to restrict the idea of development. Development reaches its culmination with the mature adult, whereas I think Jung was much more looking at it as a lifelong process. So this question of the two halves of life, I'll come back to that. But for the moment, I want to emphasize Jung's ideas of the opposites were maintained in the service of a supraordinate idea of wholeness. He believed that opposites were parts of a whole, and therefore that the need to combine them were to understand and then to live the whole. The opposites which can be seen to be parts of the whole are also balanced parts, and Jung was preoccupied with the idea of balance. He looked at the unconscious as balancing the one-sidedness of the conscious attitude. The word he used was compensation. Dreams were particularly important in this respect, and I don't think I can do better at this point than to quote one of Jung's typical clinical examples. He cites a neurotic patient who ran a business with his younger brother. Jung picked up the fact that there was a good deal of tension between the brothers, and that his patient always seemed to be running his brother down. A series of dreams portrayed the brother as a Bismarck or a Napoleon, and always in some grandiose house or palace, such as the Vatican. Jung saw this as a projection of the patient's own grandiosity, and could then show the patient he was setting himself too high. He was thus able not to contradict the patient's image of himself as superior, but to use the dreams to do so. Jung claimed that dreams can always be understood in this way. I, and imagine most other Jungians, do not automatically interpret dreams in this way. And I think it's true to say that there are a number of Jungians who actually dispute that the unconscious has this compensatory function. But I think, nevertheless, even if one doesn't always interpret dreams in this way, one always bears it in mind. There are other ways of looking at dreams which can supplement the compensatory theory and are not incompatible with it. It was, however, Jung's contribution, and is one of the ways in which his dream interpretation differs from Freud's, and I believe it is particularly useful when the analysis seems stuck, or at life crises, which we will look at more closely in a moment. But Jung made it clear that the unconscious behaves in this way whether or not one looks at dreams. It's not only dreams, it's other manifestations of the unconscious. He considered, for example, that psychosis was an overwhelming of the conscious mind by unintegrated unconscious material. This might lead to disintegration, but that alternatively one could be inflated, or more exactly, the ego can become inflated to compensate for a sense of inadequacy. Or one could be taken over by a social role through an inner lack of identity. Moreover, Jung's whole theory of psychological types was based on the idea of balance. Extroversion compensated for undeveloped introversion. A thinking type had underdeveloped feeling, and so on. This conception of opposites was sometimes called warring opposites. For development to take place, the opposites must first be recognized. They were to be acknowledged as both parts of the self, and it was important not to identify with one at the expense of the other. Between them, one could then discern a central point. One had found, or found again, one center, which acts like the center of gravity. The center for Jung was not the ego. The ego was simply the center of consciousness. The center needed to balance consciousness and the unconscious, and this, the true center of the psyche, Jung called the self. Looking at this historically, Jung must have arrived at his conception through studying psychosis rather than neurosis. And it's worth remembering that Jung was a distinguished psychiatrist who had written a remarkable book on schizophrenia before he met Freud, and that Jung struggled with the threat of psychosis in himself, the threat of an unbalanced mind. It's worth then looking now at another example, which shows the imbalance, the unhinging, so to speak, of a weakly balanced mind. This concerned a sentimental youth who fell in love with a girl when he discovered that his own agitations were not also present in the girl, but that she would have none of him. Then, to quote Jung, he went straight to the river to drown himself. It was late at night, and the stars gleamed up at him from the dark water. It seemed to him that the stars were swimming 2 by 2 down the river, and a wonderful feeling came over him. He forgot his suicidal intentions and gazed fascinated at the strange, sweet drama. And gradually he became aware that every star was a face, and that all these pairs were lovers who were carried along, locked in a dreaming embrace. An entirely new understanding came to him. All had changed. His fate, his disappointment, even his love receded and fell away. The memory of the girl grew distant, blurred, but instead he felt with complete certainty that untold riches were promised him. He knew that an immense treasure lay hidden for him in the neighboring observatory. The result was that he was arrested by the police at 4 o'clock in the morning as he broke into the observatory. This case is remarkable for the way Jung was able to understand the meaning of a delusion. But what is more remarkable is that Jung saw the vision of the pairs of lovers in the water as a Dante-esque vision of paradise, not as wrong, but as being too much, as he put it, for his poor turnip head. One is reminded here of Jung's interest in Kekulé, whose vision of a circle of dancing couples led to his discovery of the carbon ring, the foundation of organic chemistry. The example of breakdown in the sentimental youth was given to illustrate an overwhelming inflation of a weak ego, of a similar vision which could not be assimilated like Kekulé's. The implication is that if he could have been helped to assimilate it, there would, instead of breakdown, been a transformation of the personality onto a higher level of development. It seems to me that here we have a model for understanding all crises of development. It is a model in which there is a pre-existing harmony which is disturbed. It cannot be restored except at a new or higher level. There is at the same time a terrible danger that it will never be restored at all, and the balance of the mind will be forever disturbed. It is therefore a critical moment. A decision has to be made. The onlooker will hold his breath. Which way will it go? The right decision is crucial, which is to say that we are at a crossroads. In Jung's example, the state of harmony in the young man had been disturbed by the vision of beauty and harmony in the girl, which by a process of magic participation he believed was reciprocated. When this illusion was shattered, he projected it into the vision of the stars, onto the water, and then into the heavens, but remotely beyond himself. In doing so, he fatally lost his balance. It was by generalizing from many such examples that Jung was able to develop his model of the balancing of the psyche. It was before he could have known about cybernetics with its notions of self-regulating mechanisms through negative feedback, or on general systems theory, which enables one to apply the same principle to non-physical systems and not simply to thermostats or internal combustion engines. He never really seemed to acknowledge these theories as consolidating his own. His sources were rather Plato and the Neoplatonic hermeneutic tradition of Gnosticism, alchemy, astrology, and a deep study of myths and symbols. But he could only keep his head in these bewildering and dangerous regions through a principle of balancing, which allowed him to dismiss nothing as crazy, but always as the attempt of the unconscious to compensate for some other viewpoint which was one-sided. I've chosen two rather than one of Jung's clinical examples because they illustrate a general principle, that of compensation or balance, but with certain important differences. One patient is neurotic, has dreams, and can understand how they can be constructively interpreted, while the other is psychotic and has a vision. What makes him psychotic is not that he has a vision, but his over-concrete understanding of what the vision signifies, which can be said to be delusional. The two patients are also in different stages of life, and there's no evidence that Jung regarded the second patient, the psychotic one, as being suitable for analysis. Thus, the use of a common principle does not preclude the need for careful clinical appraisal. This does not simply mean the differential diagnosis between neurosis and psychosis, but everything that is involved in the question, where is this person? Where is she heading? How does she understand her situation? And so on. It is as a guide, in the form of a map or a calendar, that we need to think of life with a capital L as a universal story with recognizable stages. This was the way Shakespeare was thinking in his famous speech on the 7 Ages of Man. But of course he realized that not everybody lives long enough to go through all 7 of them. There was, however, an expectable order of life events. Each stage is a crisis which almost forces on us a realization that life can never be the same again. Although the map or calendar provide only a general schema, they allow one to locate in space or in time the individual event. Seeing the individual event as a precisely localized part of a generalized model enables the observer to give it a more precise meaning. And I'm stressing the function of the analyst as observer. Let me illustrate this by developing the metaphor of balance. Imagine the moment when the infant, having managed to stand up without immediately falling down again, begins to take its first tottering steps. It may be that this is actually our basic metaphor for all our notions of balance, that we all have an unconscious bodily memory of our first steps. It was a development of the greatest importance, repeating in the individual baby a historical moment for mankind, even more important than landing on the moon. It was the arrival of Homo erectus. Walking on his hind legs enabled man to use his front ones for all sorts of other things. And this is one of the great divisions separating man from other animals. Even though the mother will soon be saying, he's a little terror, and he gets into everything. And she can't take her eyes off him for one moment. She usually witnesses this achievement with great joy. Imagine now a very old lady slowly tottering along. Her task is the same, but because the context is quite different, the emotions of the onlooker are different. Instead of the joyful anticipation that the baby will progress and walk and run by himself, there's the sad realization that the old lady will eventually fail, perhaps quite soon. Another way of putting this is that though their immediate aim is the same, their ultimate fate is different. And often this ultimate fate has been called the will of God. I suppose that the sort of wisdom that we hope to acquire as we grow older is the awareness and acceptance of a goal or destiny outside our will, even though we may determinedly totter on as long as we can. Thus, the meaning of an event is highly dependent on the context. In Gestalt terms, context provides the background for events which seem more prominent because they are in the foreground. The model or metaphorical map or calendar enables us to give the event greater meaning. One advantage of our imaginary patient having an analyst is that she can place in another person the role of onlooker, the kibitzer, who sees most of the game, while she, the patient, can stop worrying about it and live for the moment, live, that is, in the next association. This means that the analyst can watch her and know when and when not to go to her aid. If she loses her balance, two people here are better than one. Let's now return to Jung's idea that individuation takes place predominantly in the second half of life. What he meant by this is that life has a different purpose in the second half. Very roughly, that the first half is concerned with earthly success, like becoming independent of one's parents, getting married, and gaining status in society through work, and generally enjoying life, while the second half is by contrast concerned with a gradual running down of these aims and is a preparation for death. This requires a reversal of values in which dying is an achievement. Jung's view that man has a spiritual need every bit as important as his material needs has a special application in the second half of life. The midpoint for the change of direction is about 35, half of the traditionally expected 70 years and 10. The midlife crisis, as it has since come to be called, is the crisis of the unlived life in the first 35 years. Now, this sort of division into the two halves of life, each with its own aim, which Jung was fond of making, does not stand up very well if taken too literally. In this respect, it's like his division between male and female, or between extroverts and introverts. It is important, though, to appreciate that he did not mean them to be taken literally, but as separating types. The use of the word types was common at the time and really meant what nowadays we call models or schemata. It was in this sense of the word type that archetypes should be understood. Just as it is impossible to find an example of a pure introvert or of a typical Englishman, so we may look in vain for the typical second half of life, or maybe the typical first half. It's true, too, that many people in the second half of life have by no means achieved the goals in the first half and need help in doing so before it is too late. The value of Jung's division should not be discarded on these grounds. The midlife crisis is a clinical reality, and if anything, is both commoner and more acute than it was in Jung's day. It's interesting that the psychoanalyst Elliot Jakes, who has written a classic paper on the midlife crisis, considers that creativity has a different quality in the second half of life than it has in the first. This is very close to Jung's thought. It seems to me valid, then, if one is not to take Jung literally, to take his idea of the two halves of life to indicate a crisis of development, which occurs not only at midlife, but at a number of turning points. Each of these moments are moments of rapid change, and to do justice to this observation, I have coined, in a previous lecture that I gave, public lecture, some years ago on adolescence, I coined the term individuation crisis. By this I meant that although we think of individuation as a continuous process going on throughout life, there are certain crisis points which stimulate a more rapid and a more radical form of individuation. Although any crisis, such as illness, bereavement, or even a sudden unexpected success, like winning the football pools, can be individuation crises, stimulating either rapid growth of the personality or its destruction. They are also the generally recognized, expectable life events, some unavoidable biological ones, and others which are dependent on the culture. The list is somewhat arbitrary, but we could include the oral, anal, and genital phases of infancy, the acquisition of language and the erect posture, going to school, puberty, adolescence, the start of a career, mating, marriage, having children, the death of parents, the children going away, the midlife crisis, the menopause, retirement, the onset of old age, the decline of one's powers, and death. This list, of the same type as Shakespeare's Seven Ages, might need some modification in our present culture. One example would be divorce. Marriages can be now expected to break up. And there is remarriage and acquiring stepchildren. These are all crisis points and may bring about a considerable disruption of very old established personality patterns. Without such a breakup, no new patterns can take its place. This is well recognized in adolescence. The turmoil which most adolescents go through, and I believe it's a shame when adolescents completely miss out on the turmoil, has been called a second chance to put right what has gone wrong in infancy. Even a psychotic state in adolescence may be such a chance. Old patterns may have to be disorganized before they can be reorganized. The truth is that every crisis in life is such a chance. Like the crisis point in pneumonia, now rarely seen with antibiotics, when the patient reaches a climactic fever and then either gets better or dies, any crisis in life, whether expectable or not, can lead to destruction or to further development. It therefore corresponds to Jung's idea that individuation, though dangerous, is a worthwhile enterprise. The idea of the second chance has, in the psychoanalytic literature, a somewhat limited meaning. It suggests that a later life stage is a chance to put right or to go through something that did not happen in infancy. This is part of Freud's tendency to overemphasize infancy, which Jung objected to. Without wishing to diminish the fact that infancy is the most formative influence on the personality, which needs working through an analysis, I do want to emphasize here that Jung's attention to later stages gives recognition to the fact that quite new developments take place throughout life, and that they require study in their own right, and not just as recapitulations of earlier stages. Each stage is therefore a first chance, and a last chance, as well as a second chance. Although individuation crisis may sound reminiscent of the well-known term identity crisis introduced by Erik Erikson, I mean to convey more than a crisis which threatens identity, although it is true that identity may be affected. My term makes a specific link between developmental crises and individuation. To make clearer what I mean, it might be helpful to look more closely at the word individuation and the word crisis. Individuation, of course, implies individuality, becoming more oneself. But individuality has become too much associated with being separate from other people. In psychoanalysis, it has come to be hyphenated in a hybrid individuation-separation, a term introduced by Margaret Marler to describe the child's separation from its mother at the toddler stage. That was, she described as a sub-phase of development. Useful though this term may be in her scheme of infantile development, it confuses the issue when considering Jung, for whom the individual not only meant separation from the mother, but it retained its original sense of being undivided. This gives rise to Jung's concept meaning not only separation, but integration of the personality, a process of unification. If we now consider the word crisis, our immediate association is with something terrible having happened. The word appears nearly every day through the mass media as an economic crisis and alarming headlines such as crisis in Nicaragua. And we associate it therefore with disaster. But the Chambers Dictionary defines it simply as follows. Crisis, a point of time for deciding something. That is, when it might either terminate or take a new course, the decisive moment or turning point. And the Greek word krisis is from krinein, which, interestingly enough, does mean to separate, but also means to judge. This links it with the word critical, as when we speak of the critical moment for doing something. At the critical moment, discontinuous change occurs. It is a crisis because its outcome is uncertain, and for this reason, it is generally accompanied by anxiety, though this may be masked by various defensive maneuvers, including denial. So the term individuation crisis makes a distinction between two different processes of change, both of which are covered by the word individuation. One is the continuous change, which goes on steadily, slowly, and often, for the most part, invisibly, like growth in height. Such change may be measurable. The other is discontinuous change. This is relatively sudden and may be irreversible. It is usually thought of as a qualitative rather than a quantitative change. An example would be the loss of virginity. For better or for worse, there can be no doubt that the loss of virginity is a quite irreversible, discontinuous change. It can now be seen how Jung's idea of the two halves of life can be used as a model for an individuation crisis, which may occur at any time of life. As well as the opportunity for a profound change in structure at such moments, there is also characteristically a loss of meaning, so that whatever previously seemed of value is so no longer. There is a state in which great pain, which may be defended against in various ways, can be relieved by finding a new meaning, a new purpose in life. This may or may not happen, and there's a tendency to go back to old solutions which no longer work. The crisis is experienced as a great danger to the psyche, and it is in such situations that Jung particularly saw the unconscious as containing the new meaning, which can be understood only if one does not confine oneself to reducing the conflict to a previously unresolved infantile one. The boy who saw the stars in the river, if he had not been overwhelmed by the unconscious, might have made use of his vision in a constructive way. The beauty of the coupling of the stars might have come to have a symbolic meaning, so that he would have felt no need to break into the observatory. But it might have helped him to get over his unrequited love and possibly to make another, better relationship. To put very briefly, the typical way Jung placed a constructive meaning on such a symbol, it can be said that though every person is a unique individual, there is no truly new situation. There is a level of meaning of such universality that one is justified in speaking of a collective unconscious as well as recognizing a collective consciousness. The symbol can be shared, whereas the individual case cannot. One of the features of life crises is that they all bring about a clash between the collective and the personal, and both inflation and deflation may occur in the course of differentiating the two. Falling in love always seems to have happened for the first time, and the beloved always seems irreplaceable. Some bridge needs to be found to reach from the person in such a plight to the one who sees it as having happened many times before and liable to happen many times again. This bridge comes through the symbol produced at such times by the individual unconscious, but which reaches into the collective unconscious. The symbol acts neither in the inner nor the outer world, but in between. Jung called the way these opposites of inner and outer can be united the transcendent function, and he called the universal situation the archetype structure which builds the psyche. Falling in love is, of course, only an example, but one can see from it that failure, the loss of the loved one, can further development just as much as success, which may lead to marriage. This idea is one which Jung used over and over again. There seems to be no success without a shadow of emptiness, and no failure without a compensating hope of further growth. Even though in a sense one dies when irreversible failure occurs, one may still be reborn. I can only say maybe because there's no way of telling which way it might go. And that's what crisis means. So every life stage comes to an end, and the end is always irreversible. Its loss has to be accepted, but the realization of what is lost is so painful that one is thrown out of balance. There is, however, always another side to this. One looks to the unconscious to supply a compensatory meaning, which helps one to move on to the next stage at a higher level of consciousness. It is the analyst's knowledge that this is so that helps him to hold the patient through the crisis. But it is in the unconscious of the patient that he must look for the meaning which will restore the balance. Although in this formulation I've been following Jung as closely as I can, it's hard not to give the erroneous impression that the unconscious has some wisdom of its own, far superior to what we can attain with our conscious mind. Now, although I think Jung sometimes talked just in that sort of way about the wisdom of the unconscious, I don't think, all in all, that's really what he meant. Again, it's a question of taking a rhetorical point too literally. The idea of the compensatory nature of the unconscious can be more easily accepted if we consider that to take any point of view, one has to disavow the opposite one. As I was composing this lecture on a word processor, I kept rejecting things I didn't want to say. Sometimes I regretted this dismissal, and if I was very lucky, I could rescue the lost passages from limbo. Perhaps the unconscious can be this sort of limbo. The rubbish we've discarded suddenly becomes precious. The stone the builder discarded becomes the cornerstone. Even if we accept the theory that dreams are a sort of dustbin for all the information we don't need, and this is one current theory on the physiological function of dreams, it can be a good thing to rummage in this dustbin and find that what we've thrown away is of great value. The dreams do not contain more than an alternative point of view, which still needs to be balanced with what we already know. Wisdom may or may not then follow. Either way, we're back in balance. What Jung did particularly value about the unconscious was its tendency to provide a make-weight, which was more impersonal, more universal than the individual, though even here I'm sure that he would agree that just as often it works the other way round. An example is that of the over-intellectual schizoid personality, whose dreams may be intensely personal. I've perhaps also given the impression that Jung thought of time only in a linear way, and this is far from the truth. The midlife crisis, for example, is a crisis about time itself. Indeed, all life crises are also time crises. There's always a painful realization that the past has gone, and there's only an uncertain future, and it always seems too late. Time has gone too fast and cannot be stopped. But the resolution of this painful state can come about not simply by doing what can be done in the time that's left, nor even by the normal processes of mourning. a loss, but in reviewing time itself. The unconscious, which is said to know no time, can be quite helpful in giving one a different perspective. This is the main function of ritual, and particularly rites of passage. By putting one's own life into a larger perspective, they alter one's view not just of who and what one is, but where and when one is. Jung is full of contradictions. Very often he was well aware of this, and many of his apparent contradictions can be seen as paradoxes. There has been, as we've seen, a double aim in Jung. To live fully is to live dangerously. One has to take risks, and it doesn't matter too much if one loses one's balance, as long as one can eventually regain it and carry on, whether to make a further attempt in the same direction or make a change of direction. In practice, as I suggested earlier, it's much easier if somebody else is present who acts as a compensating force. And this is one of the main advantages of analysis. Jung's idea of balance was following a long tradition, largely to be found in esoteric writings, including Gnostic, alchemical, and Kabbalistic doctrines, which were often expressed paradoxically. The balancing metaphor is also based on the behavior of physical systems and in the idea of homeostasis, which is a tendency found in all systems. There have recently been further developments in our notions of how change takes place, which I think help us to resolve the paradoxes posed by Jung. I'm thinking here of the work of Prigogine, who has demonstrated that in certain systems, as occur in thermodynamics, there are bifurcations, which are points at which one of two things may happen. Either a loss of information, a move towards entropy, which is a state of disorder or randomness, or there may appear a new structure more complex than existed before. There is no way in which the outcome can be predicted, even in theory, even in principle. What Prigogine is describing here, in the case of thermodynamic systems, seems to follow quite closely Jung's more speculative thought concerning the psyche. The interesting point, though, which helps to deal with the paradox, is that such change, with the evolution of more complex structures, happen not when the system is in equilibrium, nor when it is far from equilibrium, but at an intermediate point where it is near to equilibrium. If we apply this to the psyche, we can see that constructive change requires disturbance, but not too great a disturbance. If the tendency towards homeostasis is too great, the psyche will simply restore the status quo, and no development will take place. If, on the other hand, the disturbance overcomes the regulating system, it will go completely out of balance. Constructive change may take place if there is not too great a loss of equilibrium. This makes understandable the common experience that it is better to fall in love if one doesn't remain in a state of unbalance, like Jung's poor young man. But the principle goes far beyond this simple example, and I think Jung's idea of how change takes place, his ideas are far in advance of Freud's, where the relevant analogies are with classical mechanics. The view of the Jungian analyst is that everything that goes wrong, if it does not destroy, carries with it a meaning which, if correctly understood, will compensate and enable the unbalanced psyche to regain its balance, hopefully not to return to what it was before, but at a new level of awareness. It is only in this way that we can make sense of irreversible change for the worse, leading to greater integration and growth of the whole individual. In the long run, a full life is also a balanced one. Thank you.